We're going to give just a minute for everyone to get comfortable in our Zoom room, and then we'll get started. As you come in, feel free to drop in the chat your name, where you're joining us from, to get an idea of where our participants are. Florida, Oregon, New Jersey, Ohio, New York. For those of you just joining, welcome. We're just giving everyone a minute and we'll get started. We do want to take a moment to ensure that everyone in the audience is ready and comfortable with the technical aspects of this webinar. As you'll see, closed captioning is enabled for today's webinar. We also have American Sign Language, ASL, capabilities enabled in this meeting. You'll see a notification that sign language interpretation is available. You can enable the interpreter view in the Zoom menu bar. If you need tech support during today's webinar, please send a chat message to Natalie and she'll be able to address that for you. Lastly, if you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them into the chat and we'll be sure to address them at the end during the Q&A period. All right, next slide, please. A standard disclaimer that the views expressed in written conference materials of publications and by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsements by the US government. Next slide, please. A little bit of information for you about the Crisis Systems Response Technical Assistance Center. SAMHSA has selected Altarum to provide training and technical assistance support to states, territories, tribal organizations, and community partners across the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline and Crisis Continuum of Care. Along with our partners, W2 Consulting Corporation and Change Matrix, who have extensive experience with crisis services and technical assistance, the Crisis Systems Response Training and Technical Assistance Center, or TTAC, was formed to support the continued growth of 988 Lifeline and build a more robust crisis care system. Next slide, please. Was Jill able to join us to do SAMHSA's introductions?
I am here.
Yeah, I'll hand it over to Jill.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We are so excited that you were able to join us today for this workforce wellness component in our webinar series. Today is a wonderful day for this session because it gives me an opportunity to say thank you to all of you all. Yesterday, we observed the 3-year anniversary of 988, and the work of the 988 Crisis Continuum would not happen without all of you and your dedicated hard work. And we recognize that there are days when the work is really, really tough. But you all show up day after day after day to just provide compassionate care to so many across our country who are in need. And we just wanted to take this time to say thank you. And hopefully today's webinar will be just a little bit of us offering back to you. We know we could never
I think Jill might be having some internet issues.
You can't hear me?
I can now. You just froze momentarily.
Okay, sorry. We hope that my internet connection is unstable. We hope that today's offering will give you back just a little bit to help when days are really, really hard. So just really quickly, the SAMHSA team, our acting director of the 988 Behavioral Health Crisis Coordinating Office, Dr. John Palmieri, he sends his greetings today. Next slide. And the next slide. And I'm going to be taking you through a little wellness exercise at the end of today's webinar. So really excited about that. And our workforce wellness lead, Captain Corey Palmer.
Thank you, Jill. We're very happy to have SAMHSA's support today. So as Jill mentioned, we'll be doing a little exercise at the end of this webinar. So we're going to encourage everyone to take a minute and get a cup of ice. You might want to do that just in a second. We're going to launch a poll for you here to learn more about our audience. Once you answer, that might be a good time for you to go and grab some ice, but we'll give you a minute a little closer to that exercise as well. So now we're going to launch this quick poll. We're going to ask you, which pillar of crisis services do you work in? And what would best describe your work? We'll give everyone just a minute or two to answer that, and then we'll share our results with you. And perhaps for the next webinar, I'll learn how to do the Jeopardy theme, so we have some nice music in the background. Give everyone just a few more seconds to be able to answer this. Let's call. For those of you who might be joining later, Stephanie has dropped in the chat some directions if you need ASL enabled for this webinar. All right, why don't we close this poll and share our results? Let's see. So majority of us are coming from the pillar of someone to call, crisis call centers. About a third of you for mobile crisis response, and about 13% from crisis stabilization. Good spread there. In terms of your roles, let's see, looks like we have quite a few crisis workers in the room, which is great because that's the audience we're aiming towards today. Some case managers, social workers, peer recovery specialists and therapists, some state leadership in the room and program managers, and as always, a few others. We're excited to have you all. Thank you for sharing that poll with us. All right, we can go to the next slide now. So our objectives today, we're going to be defining vicarious trauma and distinguish it from related concepts. We'll be able to understand signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma, and then explore the impact of vicarious trauma on crisis workers. And finally, identify personal and organizational strategies that foster well-being. Next slide, please. We all in this webinar know how important it is for us to identify ways to improve our resilience and our coping skills. So it's important too that we recognize what the cost of caring can be for us. We know that 30% of crisis workers develop conditions like depression or PTSD compared to only 20% of the general population. The impact on our workforce can be compassion fatigue, lack of job satisfaction, which can impact job turnover rates, self-perception of us as crisis workers, and our professional judgment. So it's important that we address these issues around vicarious trauma so that we can continue to build our capacity to support those around us. It's essential we address it, but it's also ethical. Go to the next slide, please. So today we have a guest speaker with us, retired Colonel Santo Pizzo from the Connecticut Army National Guard. He is a decorated veteran with 34 years of distinguished service. He just retired in June, so congratulations, sir. In addition to his military career, he was also a civilian police officer. I won't go through his entire bio, but I will share with you that I've worked with Colonel Pizzo and known him for over a decade now. And a significant portion of this content was things that he taught to me when I first started in the suicide prevention realm. So I'm very excited to have him here today to share a lot of his perspective, some real world examples, and give us really that boots on the ground perspective when it comes to vicarious trauma for crisis response workers. So next slide, I'll hand it over to you, Colonel Pizzo, let you introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. I am Santo Pizzo. As stated, I'm a retired law enforcement supervisor with approximately 20 years of service. I recently retired from the Army. I spent about 34 years total time in. 15 of those years was as Special Victims Unit investigator. Sexual assaults, suicides, fatal accidents, things of that nature. I do have a master's degree in psychology with concentration in criminal justice and a master's degree from the War College on strategic studies. I want to share, as a result of my career fields, I've sustained prolonged and extensive exposure to traumatic events and their aftermath. I received my master's degree a couple of years after I was a police officer. Instead of going to just the traditional criminal justice route, I figured that psychology would be much more beneficial in my field. And it definitely helped me, as you'll see some of the examples I'll talk about throughout my careers and how that psychology and the background helped me to remain more resilient. My goal for today, what's my goal for today? It is to provide you with tools to identify trauma and how to effectively address it, making you more resilient. I do understand with the makeup of the individuals that are here today that we have field workers that go out to the scene versus dispatchers or call centers. That closure is totally different for both of you. And as a former dispatcher myself, I'll take some time to talk about how we get closure in those two incidents. I want to go one step further, and I want to take a moment and thank each of you for the work that you do. It makes a world of difference to many, many people, not just first responders, not just the person on the phone with you, but their families, their coworkers, their friends. Your impact goes far deeper than you can imagine. So thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, sir. Excited to have you here today. And I do want to remind the audience that this topic might be heavy at times, so we encourage you to take some moments, do some grounding techniques, maybe take some deep breaths as we go through. You might identify different signs and symptoms that you've seen in yourself or your coworkers, and we recognize that the work you do can be heavy. So please take a moment to center yourself, and we'll do some mindfulness exercises afterwards too to help us kind of debrief from this. We can go to the next slide now. All right, so for us to understand vicarious trauma, we need to define it. Vicarious trauma is the emotional residue we experience from hearing others' trauma. The most common causes of vicarious trauma in crisis work is the exposure to those traumatic experiences, particularly those that include violence, abuse, or death. Crisis workers are often repeatedly exposed to intense emotionally charged situations and generally without the time needed to debrief and process between these incidents and practice resilience skills. Sir, I'm going to invite you to share your theory around the radiation effect of vicarious trauma.
Thanks so much. So this everything I'm going to talk about today, I've learned from other people. There's nothing that comes from my brain matter, so I will make sure I explain that. Been around for many years, went to different trainings, crisis intervention, peer support, first line supervisor, and a lot of these sayings came from different training events I went to. One of them, the speakers addressed trauma as radiation. And he said that, low dose radiation, you're exposed a little bit here, you're exposed a little bit there. The impact's not going to be that great on you, and you'll be able to bounce back. Also, if you have proper personal protection and you have knowledge, you can mitigate those exposures. Where it gets ugly is when you get mass trauma. So instead of like the little bit of trauma here and there, mass casualty incidents, we'll say. In Connecticut, we had the Sandy Hook mass shooting. And several of my friends went to that. Well, that was an emotional overload. It overwhelmed all aspects of first responders, trauma, healthcare workers, behavioral health. And that exposure, the radiation part of it really impacted me because the stories were told and that trauma was passed along. And I'll call that transference of trauma, and I'll talk about that a little more later. But that trauma was exposing so many people at so many levels that it overwhelmed the whole behavioral health network in Connecticut, to include first responders. It was so drastic that it actually changed state laws on how we could take care of first responders with PTSD. So it was very interesting. So in regards to the trauma, I look at it as like levels of radiation, small doses, proper equipment, proper training, proper methods to record it. You're okay. Overwhelming or continual exposure. And that's one thing I want to talk about is every day, first responders, crisis workers, intake workers, you're exposed to doses every day, and that accumulates in you. And if you don't take care of it, you don't have the right resource to address it and to detox yourself, it's going to overwhelm you. So that's one of the examples I'll talk about with radiation therapy with trauma.
Thank you, sir. Next slide, please. So when we think of work-related stress, we often hear these additional terms: secondary trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue. And while they're all potential issues, we want to make sure that we differentiate them from vicarious trauma. So secondary trauma is that collection of trauma-related symptoms that occur after secondhand exposure, generally occurring from a single short-term exposure. This is the emotional and psychological reaction to trauma, generally with immediate and acute symptoms. So unlike vicarious trauma, that would cause long-term cognitive shifts. Burnout is often caused by prolonged workplace stress and involvement in emotionally demanding situations, again, correlated to things like workload, lack of support, and organizational issues. Unlike vicarious trauma, burnout is more work-related, not necessarily tied to trauma or traumatic events in the workplace. And finally, compassion fatigue, and that describes the emotional and physical exhaustion from caring for others. Symptoms of compassion fatigue are diminished capacity or interest in being empathetic or compassionate towards others in need, and it often develops more quickly than vicarious trauma. It can be preventable and treatable with rest, support, and strengthening our personal protective factors and resilience skills. Vicarious trauma is different than these. It's more about the way a traumatic situation or circumstance can shift our worldview, our sense of safety, and even our sense of meaning. Vicarious trauma can cause psychological and existential changes. It's cumulative, often invisible, and if unaddressed, deeply harmful. While vicarious trauma may happen alongside secondary traumatic stress, burnout, and fatigue, these terms are not interchangeable. We can go to the next slide. So crisis workers, we know, are disproportionately and often repeatedly exposed to trauma in their work. In addition to the nature of the work being traumatic, we also have multiple other factors that can lead to vicarious trauma. We have our personal factors, such as personal history of trauma, high levels of empathy and dispositions to help others, a lack of emotional regulation, which is the ability for us to respond to our emotions in a healthy way. And all of these things could increase our risk for vicarious trauma. In our workplaces, if we have lack of adequate training and supervision for crisis workers, lack of or unreinforced professional boundaries, or leadership that's not trauma-informed, we could see an increased risk for vicarious trauma. There are also other factors beyond our workplace and past experiences. It could be things like trauma we see in the media or our personal lives that could add to our risk. Now, sir, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the emotional regulation piece and how much that can support crisis workers, between when they're on the call with others who need help and afterwards in that debriefing moment.
Yes. So mindfulness from the onset to post-incident is critical to resiliency. And an example I give you is when you go to that call or you're dealing with an incident as an intake worker as well, you're dealing with things that are not normal. It's not a normal event. You must remember that. You're dealing with what's not normal. And when you make these incidents normal in your mind, you're creating problems for yourself because to de-escalate them later, to deal with them later is going to be harder. So mindfulness of, okay, what's going on? How's this impacting me? Must be set right off the bat. The proper mindset of dealing with these incidents is very important. Setting the tone during high stress events is critical from the supervisor on down. An example I use is we had a critical incident where a supervisor on scene was out of control, screaming at people, giving multiple orders that were contradictory. And when I pulled up on the scene, it looked like the Keystone police were there because nobody had any idea what they were supposed to do. And that created a traumatic event because at the end of the day, when they did the debriefing, there was a lot of finger pointing. Nobody felt comfortable how that incident took place. And that trauma went home with them. So the other thing I want to talk about is not share the trauma to those that have no need to be exposed. So in this example, we went back to the police department. A coworker started sharing the trauma on scene, what they saw, the injuries, what happened right, what happened wrong, who did wrong, and that caused more trauma to their coworkers. Some of these officers went home, shared these stories with families and friends, and they continued that transference of trauma to loved ones, which makes it harder for you to heal and become resilient because they could bring it up a later time and trigger this whole example to you. Be cognizant of its impact on you and others. Seek out methods to regulate its impact on you in your personal and professional roles. Have a method. We talk about exercise, talk about diet and all that good stuff, but also have a healthy manner to decompress. Also, if you have clinicians, healthcare workers, clergy that you're going to share your stories with, to offload that trauma.
Thank you, sir. Next slide. So how do we identify vicarious trauma? The signs and symptoms can generally be broken down into 3 categories: emotional, behavioral, and physical. Vicarious trauma can show up in many ways. It might be emotional numbing, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, even physical symptoms like fatigue or insomnia. Behaviorally, it could lead to isolation, cynicism, or a diminished sense of accomplishment. So it can really impact how we relate to others and how we see the world. We want to talk for a minute about our area of expertise in the military and first responder arena. And one of the biggest issues we have, or signs and symptoms we see, is that increased substance use. So Colonel, I'm going to let you speak to that and how we've maybe tried to mitigate that.
So in the military and in law enforcement, early on, I'm talking when I was 18 years old when I joined the military, and I was 25 when I joined law enforcement. The number one tool that I saw that was used was alcohol. And I'll give you an example early on with this is first critical incident that I was involved in. Supervisor came over and said, we're doing choir practice. And I'm sure some of you know what that is, but for those that don't, it's basically an informal term for we're going to get together after work and we're going to consume outrageous amounts of alcohol and we're going to decompress amongst ourselves. And I thought, wow, this is a great idea. What a great idea. We're going to have camaraderie and all of that. Well, what I didn't realize is we're dealing with a post-traumatic incident where people were exposed to trauma. Usually it's either serious physical injury or death. And now we get together and we consume alcohol and we're making more poor judgments. And we're not addressing the tone. We're not addressing what happened or what we could do better. No formal debriefing process. And you start having poor and tasteless jokes taking place, unempathetic comments about the incident. And what's happening was officers were going home to their spouses and then now they're intoxicated and having problems at home, domestic issues. Some police officers got pulled over after drinking. So you have more trauma taking place there, right? Because now it's impacting your work life and finances and all of that good stuff. And what we do see is, so alcohol is not a good idea. If any of you are using alcohol as a debriefing tool or a way to decompress, I strongly suggest you reassess that. There's so many resources out there that will point you away from alcohol, and alcohol is not a good tool to be used. In law enforcement and military, caffeine use is much higher than normal. We use a lot of caffeine, which has other impacts. Not the end of the world, but just be cognizant of your caffeine use because it's going to impact your sleep patterns. It's going to impact your heart, your blood pressure, and in your anxiety rates altogether. Tobacco, nicotine, same thing. When I came into the military, it was almost everybody smoked. Almost everybody was doing nicotine packets, and now we're getting away from that. My son's in now, and he's telling me these trends now is energy drinks. So here we go again. We're consuming energy drinks that have all kinds of stuff in there. Caffeine is usually one of the big indicators and that ingredients in there. So just be cognizant of that usage. Poor work and rest balances is a big problem amongst first responders, critical intake workers. Make sure you have a solid work rest balance. If you don't, you're going to have other issues taking place. Makes it harder to become more resilient. Use and abuse of prescription medications. So we'll see in the military and in law enforcement, go to the doctor, hey, doc, I can't sleep at night, and they'll quickly write you some kind of prescription for sleep aids. Be very careful and cognizant of sleep aids because they can have impact on you. So the first incident I told you about choir practice was I was a patrol officer in 1996. So 2006, 10 years later, I'm a supervisor. I had a critical incident take place, and I said, "Well, let me retool this." And what I did is we had food, we had non-alcoholic beverages, and what I did is I invited everybody that was involved because I remember sitting in that chair as a dispatcher. So I had my dispatchers there, I had my EMS there. If it was a fire call, I had firefighters there, and if it was a fatal, we had tow truck workers that were contracted by the town. I had them there, and we did a formalized debrief. It's the first 5 or 10 minutes just to unwind. Obviously, I'm still in charge as a supervisor. I'm dictating the conversation. So we're not doing crass jokes. We're not doing unempathetic comments. But I'm also making sure that we're not transferring trauma. Especially in law enforcement, we take photos, right? Crime scenes, things of that nature. I made sure that everyone understood. Don't show those things. 2 reasons. One is privacy and expectation of privacy of that. 2 is someone else's family member that you're pointing out in these photos. And 3 is you're transferring that trauma that doesn't need to be transferred. About 10 minutes, 15 minutes into it, what I would do then is I would say, hey, what did we do right? And we did a moment by moment walk through the incident from when the call came in all the way to the end of it. And I made sure everybody understood what we did right. And then when I talked about what could we do better, never said what we did wrong, never said who did what wrong. I made sure that nobody walked out of there thinking that they did anything wrong. A lot of these decisions are split-second decisions, and you could, Monday morning quarterback them. And that's transferring trauma too. If I turn around and look at one of my subordinates and say, hey, you did that wrong, and we were talking about a death, is he going to walk home and think, wow, I killed somebody? Well, that's not what I meant, but let's say he took it that way. So I made sure we talked about what we did right, what we could do better. And then I would stick around for a half hour by myself and give individual officers a chance to come over and say, hey, Sergeant, I'm having a hard time with this, or did I do the right thing, or what could I do better? And we were able to go home putting this to rest as best we could. And what that did is it reduced the amount of sick time abuse, alcohol abuse, and complaints against officers and dispatchers the next day.
Thank you, sir. Next slide. So that goes into the cumulative effects like you just talked about. We can understand that if our daily functions aren't happening according to plan because of traumatic events we've experienced, we could see things like coworkers who are habitually calling out. We could see negative effects that happen to us in the workplace. Unchecked vicarious trauma doesn't just hurt us individually, it can affect the whole system. We can have high turnover, absenteeism, reduced quality of care, strained team dynamics. And like the Colonel said, ultimately, if we're not taking care of ourselves and our colleagues, the people we serve are going to suffer as well. Next slide. So we've given you a lot of technical information definitions, but we wanted you to consider for a second this scenario. So you have a 90-day call center volunteer who's been volunteering for 3 years, has recently voiced frustration with their role, stating, "I don't know or even bother, we don't help anyone." When you ask why they feel that way, they state that for every one person they feel that they've helped, there are 3 others who are in a worse position. And as you talk, they disclose they haven't been sleeping well for a while, staying up at night, thinking and rethinking interactions, and blaming themselves for not doing more to help. So could this be a sign of vicarious trauma? It absolutely could be. So there are probably elements of this scenario you're able to recognize in yourself or maybe in your colleagues, and it could be a sign that vicarious trauma is starting to emerge. It's important that we have open, direct conversations about the signs and symptoms we see so that the right supports can be put into place to prevent worsening symptoms. Go to the next slide. All right, so what do we do about vicarious trauma? We try to build our resilience. So resilience is going to act like a protective buffer against vicarious trauma, helping us adapt and recover from repeated exposure. Now, resilience doesn't mean invulnerability. It does not eliminate the stress or the traumatic exposure we're having, but it does enhance our ability to cope. So our personal factors, like our mindset, are we willing to grow and learn through our experiences? Are we taking care of our most basic needs, like sleeping, hydrating, eating well, regulating our emotions? And can we see the value that we bring through the work that we're doing? We have team protective factors that allow you to understand your role clearly and contribute meaningfully. We might want to foster these positive coworker relationships where everyone is accountable, and that would strengthen our ability to persevere and receive support from one another. Regular supervision and the opportunity to debrief in a supportive, trauma-informed environment can help us let go of that trauma we're experiencing. Utilizing proven forms of debriefing, like critical incident stress debriefing, could be helpful for us as a team. And then organizational factors. Now, we might have less control over these, but they are key to professional resilience. Having access to resources that support our mental well-being, such as EAP, on-site behavioral health support, or standard operating procedures or processes that are trauma-informed and enforced. Organizations that invest in their workers and provide opportunities to gain and build skills that reinforce resilience will see lower turnover and higher job satisfaction rates. Resilience is both a personal trait and a skill that we can learn and grow over time. Now, Colonel Pizzo is a master resilience trainer. So I'm going to allow you, sir, some time to just talk about some resilience techniques and training that you've experienced and how that helps us bounce back quicker.
Yes, I'll start off with being aware of signs of trauma and tools available to address said trauma is critical to resiliency. Over the years, I can tell over the last 30 years, I've been involved with trauma and traumatic events. The stigma is still there, nowhere near as bad as it used to be, but it still is there. I remember early on when I had a critical incident, walking away from a sergeant after I debriefed him on what took place. He's like, "Oh, and by the way, the number of EAPs on the wall if you need it." And that was his check the block that he spoke to me about EAP. So we were doing a better job in that, but we still have a way to go. The first step that I would suggest is self-assessment and personal inventory. And that should be taking place immediately after the critical incident, the next day, and then about a week after. You don't want to keep doing this too long because then you're just re-indoctrinating yourself with the incident. But I'd say within 24 hours, immediately upon it happening, 24 hours, then about a week later, ask yourself this question: am I okay? How do I feel? How do I feel about the incident? How is it impacting me and my performance? And then I would ask you, what do I need to know for closure? And especially for the dispatchers and people that are taking these calls online where there is not that face-to-face interaction. I will tell you as a first responder, when I was on scene as a supervisor and I got there, I had immediate closure. Okay, the child's breathing. Okay, she's out of the pool. We saved her. Everything's good. Well, the dispatcher is waiting for that information. And when I became a supervisor, I made sure that as soon as I was on scene, I gave an update to the dispatchers and AMR, the ambulance that was coming on scene. So everybody knew what was taking place because we want that closure. But I would say that that's a huge step in this. And then the next step to being resilient is a structured debriefing process. That's the next step towards resiliency in my mind. And examples of an effective debrief would be closure for everyone and growth, personal professional growth. So those are the takeaways with having a structured debriefing is a closure and a growth. Megan, back to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So we have the most control over our personal protective factors and our personal resilience strategies. So it's important, like Colonel Pizzo just said, we do an inventory of ourselves. What are our resilience strategies? Which ones are effective for us and which ones do we maybe need to incorporate more during our daily activities? So there's several ways we can practice some of our personal resilience. We might do reflective supervision or peer debriefing. We could build routines that include rest, nutrition, and movement. We can set clear boundaries around work to try to help maintain that work-life balance and cultivate meaning and connection and remember why you started this work. So we want to also engage in self-care that's actually restorative for you. So a lot of people view exercise as a self-care activity. And for some, it very well may be. But if you're doing it, and while you're doing these activities, you're seeing it as one more obligation in your day, it's taking time away from other responsibilities you have, then it's not truly restorative for you. So we want to think of activities that bring calm to us, bring us peace, that promote that restoration without feeling like an additional pressure on you. I'll tell you from personal experience, yoga is always suggested to me, and it is not restorative to me. I do not have balance. It does not help. I've identified that is not self-care for me, but other activities might be. And overall, we want to make sure that we're normalizing help-seeking behaviors with ourselves and with those around us. So, sir, I know that the work-life balance for these crisis responders and in that first response field is really difficult. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the self-awareness that goes into maintaining that work-life balance.
Yes, thanks. Especially in law enforcement, I'll talk about the shift work. So you immediately have barriers there because the day shift versus the midnight shift, two different creatures, right? You're sleeping. If you're a midnight worker, you're sleeping during the day. It's usually not the best quality sleep. Then you have forced shift coverage. So usually in military and everywhere, military and law enforcement, we see usually it's done by seniority. So your junior officers are being forced to cover shifts. The overtime versus personal time conflict, very difficult. So, hey, I can work an extra overtime. I had a traumatic event today. I'm kind of struggling with it, but I just got offered a midnight shift tomorrow morning. Do I take it or not? So those are conflicts I see with officers. Instead of taking a knee and drinking water and doing that personal inventory, they're like, I'm going to come back tomorrow because I need the overtime. It's going to impact my pension and extra money for me to do stuff. Then we have the lack of sleep and personal recovery. Sleep, you'll see so many studies about sleep and the importance of sleep, especially when we're talking about trauma, how important it is to have proper sleep. There was a study out there, and I wish I could tell which one it was. If you go 24 hours without sleep, it's like you're DUI. You're in that haze. So just take that in consideration. In my police department, we could work 16 hours max. You had to come off after that. When I was first hired, there was no such thing. You could actually work 24 hours straight. Well, you're up way more than that because you have at least an hour before roll call, an hour after. You're talking somebody's awake for up to 26 hours. That's very dangerous. Separation from continued trauma or continued exposure. So the more you come back to work and not take that rest we're talking about, the less time you have separation. That cycle is going to keep going. It's not healthy for you. Breaking down stigmas that still exist from behavioral health. I'll talk about that. Till I turn blue in the face? They still exist. And then for first responders, whether it's fire, EMS, police, there's a superhero syndrome, where amongst ourselves we don't want to talk to our friends and say, "Man, it's really impacted me," because you don't want your coworkers to think maybe you're weak or you're not made for the job. A lot of times I heard, "Oh, he's just not cut out for the job." Is that really the case, or is that a burnout fatigue, or is it maybe poor supervision? But superhero syndrome is out there, so we need to be cognizant of that. A tool I learned in the military came from Master Resiliency training. The Army, I'm sure you all track, and the military in general, has had significant suicide issues for the last 20 years, and they're trying to really wrap their head around how to fix this. And they came out with Master Resiliency training. It's an unbelievable course. Law enforcement has something close to that called crisis intervention training. And one of the tools I took out is hunt the good stuff. When you're in that funk and you're surrounded by bad stuff happened at work, don't go back to the news and watch the story because you're involved in it. Hunt the good stuff. Look for positive stories. Look for restorative stories. Look at things that are going to have a positive effect on you, not just the bad stuff. And when you do that personal inventory, like, why do I go to work? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? Well, for my family. So that should be the good stuff too, is when, hey, how do I get out of this funk? Or why do I need to get out of this funk? Use those things that are motivating you to get you out of that funk. It was called Hunt the Good Stuff. There's so much out there on the internet about that. You can look that up if you want to. Megan, that's all I have for that.
Thank you, sir. As somebody who took one of Colonel Pizzo's resiliency trainings, I can tell you that Hunt the Good Stuff has been crucial to me in a lot of my personal resilience. So thank you for sharing that skill with us. Go to the next slide. So a lot of the strategies Colonel Pizzo has spoke about are really at the organizational level. And so while personal practices are important, it's also important that organizations take responsibility too. So trauma-informed supervision, manageable caseloads, access to mental health support, a culture of psychological safety, all of those are essential. Resilience can't rest solely on the individual. It has to be baked into our system. So some practical tools for that might be regular team check-ins focused on emotional wellness, structured self-care plans for staff, access to EAPs or other support services. Having them aren't enough. We need to make sure that people are aware of how to access them. And maybe using more reflective questions in team meetings, like what was hard about today, or what do you need right now, versus our standard, how are you doing? Maybe we ask more targeted questions to really learn what's going on with our staffs. And it says we want to celebrate wins, little ones, incremental ones, all of those things that help us build that resilience and remember why we're in this work. Changing workplace culture takes time, but patience and persistence will go a long way towards that. We'll go to the next slide. So we gave you a lot of information about what vicarious trauma is, what it looks like, what we can do. But to give you maybe a better real world picture, we're going to share with you a case study. And while this is a true case, it has been anonymized to allow us to respect the individual's privacy. To set the scene for you, again, focused in our military experience, a lot of our interventionists are 24/7 mobile crisis. We have our own internal structure that we use. So in this situation, we had a full-time suicide and crisis intervention specialist who was starting to show signs of vicarious trauma, noted by irritability in the workplace, increased cynicism, sleep disturbances, lack of appetite, withdrawal, noted repeated exposures to trauma in the workplace, such as client substance use and overdoses, deaths by suicide, having to conduct suicide investigations, which include next of kin interviews, having leadership that wasn't necessarily trauma-informed or doesn't use a trauma-informed approach. Next slide. So the personal factors that we identified in this case, there was repeated workplace exposure to trauma, recent significant health issues that had since been resolved, personal history of trauma, working in a small, potentially less qualified team, meaning that the team maybe didn't have as much experience or education on the work that was happening, and interdepartment conflicts. So leadership not clearly defining roles, not sure who's taking charge of situations when maybe both departments are on scene, those types of conflicts. And then the protective factors that were identified was the individual was highly trained, was well regarded by peers in the organization. The team members did identify that there were signs of burnout occurring, and they had a large support network, both personally and professionally. So we identified both risk and protective factors. We'll go to the next slide. And then these were the identified gaps that we saw. So a small team was causing repeated trauma exposure without time to process. They had to respond back to incidents. No formalized debriefing process. There was fear of causing secondary trauma, like Colonel Pizzo talked about, if we spoke to others about the crisis situation. Same individuals had to do repeated suicide death investigations. There was a lack of awareness or knowledge of employer supports that existed. The clients felt like they could only contact very few people to get support, so it felt like a one-door approach to help, again, causing repeated trauma exposure to that individual. There was a lack of organizational support and no clear supervision plan. In an interdepartment working space, sometimes there's multiple supervisors for different work streams, so not having that clarity of who's responsible for that supervision on a regular basis. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Colonel Pizzo, and he's going to tell you what his recommendations were and how it went.
So my recommendations were quite substantial. I had them do it I wanted a written standard operating procedure. I want it in writing. So it doesn't matter who the supervisor is, it doesn't matter who's in that day when something happens. They can go to the book and there is step-by-step what to happen. So we have continuity. It wouldn't be if a certain supervisor's on, something good happens. If it's somebody else, they don't know where to start. So I wanted it in writing. I wanted supervisor buy-in, all the way up to the chief of police, in the military, all the way up to the adjutant general. I want the head of the organization saying, this is what right looks like, and we all got to adapt to it. I want to make sure that there was funding appropriated for it. And what we did is, like, we had administrative days. So as a supervisor, if I had a critical incident the day before and an officer walks in or a dispatcher walks in, I could tell right away they're having a hard time, or they self-disclose and say, I'm having a hard time. Then I can give them an administrative day, not take a sick day from them or a vacation day from them, and let them either work inside the buildings, because sometimes people don't want to go home, right? They don't want to be alone. So I'd give them the options. Hey, you don't want to work the road today? Do you want to sit out front, and take, incoming calls at the front desk, or do you want to just do a ride along with another officer, or do you want to just hang out with me? But I gave them options, and I was empowering them to become resilient. And once the administration got involved, so unfortunately, and everything comes out to money, okay? So when you start talking these things, these programs, you can have people saying, oh, there's a lot of money associated with this. When I broke down the cost, I did an analysis of this, and I won't bore you with it, but the reality is, if Santo Pizzo can't come to work because I have mental health problems, or if I do a bad thing as a police officer, you're talking $1 million lawsuit. And when you start talking about that got their undivided attention, and they were firmly behind this program. And what do we get out of it? I was able to show, in short order, reduce sick time usage, reduce civilian complaints, increase trust in one another and the organization, which is huge. Because if you know your organization has your back, you're willing to put yourself out there. Willingness to share our stories amongst ourselves about seeking assistance. And that broke down the barrier of, hey, I need some help. And EAP was one of them. We had a chaplain program that was created because of this. We retooled the choir practice like I talked about. And I made sure that all supervisors knew the impact of the alcohol and how we're doing things wrong, and how supervisors are responsible for that. Even in the military, when we do a debriefing, where we do 3 up and 3 down, we call some different things, but we make sure that there's no finger pointing taking place. The end result of this is the officers embraced it so much that we became empathetic, way more empathetic than we were in the past, because we do death notifications as police officers too. So we use this example. So when we did death notifications, we did them much more professionally. It wasn't just a matter of fact anymore. And about a year into it, we were so involved with the community with this that we created a trauma toy program, first of its kind around here at least. And what it was is, we had trauma toys in our cars. And if you went to an incident and there was a child involved, whether the child's house burned down or the dog was hit and killed, or if mom and dad had a domestic and the child was exposed to this, we would have trauma toys to give the kids. And we received rave reviews later on for that program. I don't know if it still exists. The town I live in, every year I contribute to their trauma toy program because it's such an awesome thing. But at the end of the day, we had that growth and that resiliency that we're trying to do by having that.
Yes, sir. Next slide. So as Colonel Pizzo said, funding obviously becomes an issue. And honestly, it was the biggest issue in this case study. So with that big list of recommendations, here's what we came up with, and what worked was, like you said, the formalized debriefing process, promoting no wrong door approaches to help, having additional built-in organizational supports, expanding the team to have other qualified professionals, whether that's additional duty assignments, having people like the chaplain that he spoke of available, doing that intentional team building, taking the time to do after action reports, the 3 things that went well, 3 things we could improve, gentle pressure on the team to use their time appropriately. Some of you might be like me and I bank my PTO. I'm not sure why, but I do. It's important that we use that more effectively to make sure that we're not being overexposed to trauma. And then implementing a trauma-informed procedure for suicide crises. So making sure that the policies that we're developing and enforcing have a trauma-informed lens to them. Changes don't happen overnight. They often take months or even years. So it's important that the collective work and support of multiple departments and colleagues goes into this. It's important to break down each challenge into manageable steps and celebrate the little victories along the way. The work we do won't get easier, but by being aware of the potential signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma and being proactive in building our resilience, we can mitigate its impact and sustain our capacity to help. Next slide. Next slide. Wonderful. I want to give a big thank you to our ASL interpreters because I know Colonel Pizzo and I speak quickly. I'm sure that was quite the exercise for you all, but we appreciate your support.